Hello, I'm Ashley Liza Smith, and I'm very excited to be here talking to you today about real-time participation, world building, improvisation, and liveness. Let's see, I am going to start actually with, part of my talk today is going to be a bit about work that I've been a part of, but it's also going to be about really thinking through a lot of these ideas around real-time and all of the words in my title, and kind of where I'm at currently with thinking about them. So I'm hoping that it'll be a bit of a dialogue too with everybody in here. So I'm imagining it's already 2:30, so I'll speak for 30-40 minutes or so, and then we can have a discussion if that's okay. But I kind of wanted to start off with, like, I just was having this really great conversation with Karen on the way over here, and I was thinking about what do I mean by this word real time. Also, the way that this word is slipping, or there's slippage around this word, especially now that I'm dealing with students that I work with. What is reality versus what is real time? Is it about a mediated presence? What is, if it is about having some kind of, is it a machine? Does that include machine time? So really thinking about, like, all these kind of propositions I'm going to put out. They slip into one another and they're not fixed, but I'll just kind of start off my talk with how I'm thinking about or thinking through these sorts of things, because as someone who is working with world building and co-authorship and a huge believer in the writer's room and other kinds of ways that we create art and design with other humans live. There's also other ways that I'm working in real time with game engine technology and other sorts of, what we're doing right now, Zooming. So I'm really curious. So I'm thinking about, like, there's these kind of other layers inside of real time, which I'm thinking about time capture. So obviously, like, surveillance, and inside of these, there's other sorts of time concepts like capital time and agricultural time. But really around real time, there's like this notion of simulcasting, which I guess we're kind of doing right now with this Zoom hybrid talk. There's, of course, this idea of lag, which I see happening right now, even in my camera screen that's being recorded right here to the right. Also telehealth, I currently am living in the very center of the United States and very rural place. And so the abilities to have surgery by people who are living on the coast is ever increasing, right? And so what all of those systems mean in terms of real-time precision. Slippage, this is a still from a film called The Game, and I'm not sure if anyone's seen it, but also kind of thinking about the magic circle as in games, as in play, and there's lots of things that have been written about dark play or deep play. What does it mean when only certain people in the room know that there's a game being played, but other people might not know? And that kind of slippage between play and, augmentation of reality through magic circles or role play. Remote control, but in remote control, I'm also including remote sensing, remote viewing. I work a lot with scientists and engineers, and right now, in the center of the United States, I actually believe it is the edge of a lot of technological advances in terms of what is called precision agriculture and the ability to grow food to feed humans, and how that's reliant on these kind of systems of being able to remote view, remote sense, machine vision, et cetera, from perhaps drones or robots or other kinds of machine learning. Live streaming, which again, we're partaking in right now. Social media time as a form of real time, I believe. I'm thinking through this as different than the other forms. For example, this is a still from something called $1 Hotel in I believe in China, where if you would consent to your stay being live simulcasted to the world, then you could stay in this hotel room for $1 a night with that agreement. Entropy, I put this in there because I think about this a lot, and maybe this is where real time and real or liveness kind of separate, but I think about entropy as a thermodynamics concept, but I'm really into it in terms of thinking about it. And any fans of improvisation or stand-up comedy in here know the best parts of stand-up are the parts where it completely, like a thermodynamic system, heats up, things come together, and it's totally kismet. It's magic when it all comes together. However, that precipice of it all falling apart is that kind of entropic kind of chaos. That is, I believe, what is so attractive to a lot of kind of things that are live, that do include this kind of notion of improvisation, of play, that things could fall apart at any moment, and that kind of pleasure in the fact that they could fall apart at any moment. Constrained time, this is a still from We Live in Public, which was putting these kind of tech artists in kind of boxes and seeing what unfolds, really laying the groundwork for other kinds of real-time things like reality television. And I think, well, at least in the United States, going to become very important again with however long the current writer's strike. Last time there was a writer's strike, we saw the increase of reality television, and will that happen again? Will it now be with AI co-authors, et cetera, et cetera? Time collapse, so thinking about ways that time might collapse in real time, surveillance time, which I kind of hit on with time capture, and fictional time. So these are kind of like spaces that I'm like thinking in right now around these ideas of real time. And I'll go back to my talk now, but just to kind of open up the talk with thinking about those sorts of things. So this is a still from a project that I did, which I'll talk about in just a second. It was a LARP in a mall in San Diego, California. But before, I'll just say that, yes, I'm an assistant professor of emerging media arts at the Johnny Carson Center for Emerging Media Arts in the brand spank middle of the country of the United States. I'm right now working in London, and so I was really excited about this invitation to come over here and speak. I met Karen at Screenwriting Research Network conference in Vienna last fall, and attended Karen's talk, which was amazing, really laying a lot of the groundwork philosophically around a lot of what I do in terms of world building, worlding, thinking about what this means. But I'm definitely not a philosopher, but approaching it much more from an artist, practitioner, designer standpoint. So again, just going to talk to you through some of the projects and the way I'm using it, and please ask me questions at any moment. So I run a lab that's really thinking about storytelling, narrative, what are the limits, and what are, everything from deep fakes to what we're talking about today, world building. This was a LARP that I ran in a place called Horton Plaza Mall. It was built by an architect, Jan Yerdy, with the science fiction writer, Ray Bradbury had written a brief about this mall. It was a very important mall because architecturally it was a postmodern mall in which literally floors did not match up. So it was designed in a similar way that Las Vegas casinos are, which kind of trap you in. And so you can't even get out. So you just kind of consume and consume and consume. And there's a big thing called Comic-Con that happens every year there, which is essentially people dressing up in costumes and kind of celebrating all of the Hollywood lore that it like kind of descends on San Diego. It's a huge, huge mess. And we proposed with a group of artists, what if we stage this kind of like alternate reality LARP inside of the mall in Horton Plaza, with even having a live band, and kind of took over the mall with 4 different cameras and shot this in real time, improvisationally unfolding this LARP. And we set the LARP in another planet and kind of wrote this whole backstory. And I presented the piece in a few different places, but it was really interesting. Did I get permission beforehand? No, it's definitely one of those situations of it might be easier to get permission it's easier to get forgiveness than permission. So kind of, you know, thinking about like the ways we took over the escalator became the break room, and, you know, really just shifting what was the constraints of reality onto this like space, to become another planet, and to kind of play out it was actually one of Ray Bradbury's stories that we kind of wrote over. That's another still from that. So I work in this realm of speculative design. I'm just going to like unpack these words a bit for everyone as I use them. But speculative design being, I think, a component and it's adjacent to world building, which is just a design practice, which is asking questions, which is speculating on possible futures. It might also be going backwards and historically and taking things that could have happened or counterfactuals, perhaps changing historical narratives and bringing those into the present and then shooting those into the future. Another still from like a project of kind of co-authoring and another kind of LARP that we ran inside of, this was at the Museum of Contemporary Art in San Diego, which was, for a moment, they removed all of the art during World War II and turned this into a space for soldiers returning from the war that needed to be hospitalized. There weren't enough hospitals. And so in this rendition or rewrite of the piece, I have two kind of a younger and older Japanese opera singers who are kind of playing out in parallel realities, their own kind of version of this moment of World War II, from like a Japanese American standpoint. And again, one of the components that kind of ties a lot of these together is also just thinking about space and architecture and spatiality and place. And again, the ways that space and time can perhaps be collapsed into a myriad of pasts and a lot of futures. One of the main questions that my lab asks is, can fiction shape science? And more specifically, how does story shape science? And I know that, especially in the United States right now, these can be like very polarizing statements because there's a lot of very anti-science sentiment right now, or people that get really bristly when I start to talk about the fiction of science. But I'm a strong believer that fiction shapes science. We have so many examples from pop culture, from the classic examples from Star Trek receivers to Iron Man exoskeletons to, I'm trying to think of some more recent examples of this. I mean, even Uber was an app that was kind of first thought of in a science fiction story. So that's all to say that so much of what happens in science, technology, engineering, innovation, startup culture is actually starting on the fiction side and then gives rise to by the innovation science world. And so as I started this talk and I said precision agriculture in the middle of the country, I've been working a lot in these kind of zones and thinking about world building across with people who have very, I think one of the places that I've seen and enjoy working is across different communities that might think that politically or world views might be very different, but how that can actually engage in a lot of conversation around occupying futures together. Recently, at a Water for Food conference, there were people in the room with radically different political beliefs, many of them ranchers, many of them living off the land in different kinds of ways and would never think that they would ever agree on anything. We gave them a future scenario that was 300 years in the future and a future planet, and ran an entire scenario with them. And within very quick time, people who would never think that they would have a conversation together were all of a sudden, creating basically a socialist government that was going to take over this other planet. And it is in those kind of like moments of, enough futuring where we can go from, I think that the data right now says that 10 years out, we can go from saying I to we. So that shift of even being able to think beyond just the self and kind of shifting into more community ways of thinking, also thinking beyond the human. And I'm right now I'm working on a game with a National Institute of Health science grant, which is for young learners, but the game is in VR, and it's letting students kind of embody different parts of a system. So they start as a human, but they very quickly move into being an apple tree and have to move towards the light. And their whole kind of, I guess, payoff of the game is trying to balance this, or trying to understand this interdependent system. After you play the apple tree, you switch into playing a planting robot, which is helped to training machine intelligence to plant food. And then the last perspective in this game right now is a prairie dog perspective, which you're playing as a prairie dog, uncovering these kind of sensors that's sensing water and health level of the plants above. So really trying to think about not just how world building can have humans talk to other humans, but also is there possibilities for thinking more in terms of multi-species design, or designing beyond the human, and how speculative design and world building help us get into those spaces. Lots of times as part of the country where I'm currently living, I did grow up on the coast of the United States, and I have lived in many other places, but this part of the world is often referred to pejoratively as flyover country, a place that is only a place that a coastal elite would only fly over. There's no reason to actually visit this place or to stop. And this is something that's kind of, joked around a lot and said, but there's like very, very, I think, real truths to this in terms of how infrastructure is working right now. Because one of the things that many people, and I'm sure it's similar here in Belgium, but the rural is often the zones where the systems like solar, like the cloud for internet, like silica for our phones, mining, all of these kind of infrastructures that are kind of feeding the urban are oftentimes placed. And so they're very much interconnected. And so it's been really important, as I've been working in this context, to kind of connect these kinds of systems, so wind, et cetera. And so one of the projects that I've been working on is pairing artists and scientists together. These projects called Flyover Fictions. And the artists and scientists work together over a year. The artists really like in the laboratory with the scientist. In this case, this was Santosh Pitla, he's a roboticist who works with agriculture. And then Par Gang, who's an artist designer in Berlin. Together, they do several lab meetings and talking both across each other's work, and then start to kind of work and design and world build a kind of future fiction. And in this, and artists and scientists they're given a budget, and they're able to depict that in any kind of way they want. That could be a game, that could be, in this case, it was something much more akin to like a comic book, drawings, etc. But there's with writing. And I'm going to publish these in the upcoming year, but I just wanted to show them today. But this is one of them, which is kind of thinking about the future of farming and who's farming. It may not look like what you think is farming, and thinking about the changing demographic of that. This flyover fiction is a designer, Andrea, from Spain, and Shannon Bartelt Hunt, who's a civic engineer. Shannon Bartelt Hunt would very much go into the ground every day. She's one of the scientists that kind of during COVID really broke out how when you go and look for, you can take samples, underneath in sewages and start to see like where COVID is happening. But at the same time, there's data in our shit, basically, that also has a lot of other kinds of implications, like who's using what kinds of drugs and, what someone's like health of their microbiome, et cetera. So in their flyover fiction, they're really thinking about the extension of the microbiome, gut data, and really thinking about like, in a really simple way, who owns your data when you flush the toilet. Perhaps it's not something you've thought about, but there are smart toilets being developed. So in their flyover fiction, they were really thinking about, in this case, you can see everything from like the cows and the decomposing matter, a lot of this kind of whole cycle that goes from the toilet to cows to food to the table, and kind of this cycle of what we're putting in our body, and the data around that. So I guess I'll start here and just talk about an example from a class, which where I gave this was during COVID, where I gave students a brief that really made them think about it's called the Haymarket, the market in Lincoln, Nebraska, and made them think about the future of this market. Now, in this case, this was a really interesting example, which was like working out of the limitations of the moment of during COVID and being kind of like spread out online. But what came out of it was really, really awesome, because I don't think it would have happened, and I would have uncovered what would have had we all been in person. And so people started coming up with their own stories online. And in this case, they really had to think about a kind of future that was very much multi-species, thinking about things like what if rivers had rights, et cetera, et cetera. But they were doing collaborative writing and storytelling. And then what we used then was Mozilla Hubs as this container for putting the writing and story inside of those spaces. And then we eventually got together and did a kind of live action role play in line, in which the stories that people were coming up with, they were able to act out. And some of them even like brought in voices. And a lot of them were starting to realize, like, actually, like the story's falling apart in this kind of way, or it's not working in this other kind of way. And so then we were able to continue that into a cinematic space, where they were doing screens, where they were coming up with short scenes and actually turning some of that really early improvisation work into scripting. So after all of that kind of like, I guess you could call ideation and research and development, we end up like working through the script into this kind of, we end up in this place where we can take all of that. We've exercised it out. We've even co-written, co-authored through just like that, through basically rehearsal, live action, role play, through improvisation. And then that can start to form the basis of the script. And then there's other ways that we could do this, where we could then take that script back in and kind of start to work that out. And all of that was like really an exciting process that I have not really, it was kind of an accident, and it was really kind of forced, but because of COVID. I've done all of those things in certain kinds of capacity, but not in that kind of way. And so, this idea of liveness, which again, I think is about either framing through a camera or creating a magic circle around something that allows this exercise of kind of a collaboratory or participatory co-authorship in this kind of space. I think this quote here is interesting. Being a writer is a fictional production, but Nietzsche inverts the relation between fiction and authorship. So it's not only the fiction that belongs to the author who writes it, but the author who belongs to the fiction that writes them. And kind of seeing more and more with these exercises and role play and world building, how this starts to really kind of play out. So this got extended out into a radio play that I was able to do for the first time last summer. This was pre like the invention of ChatGPT, but really, you know, wanting to lean into the space of kind of seeing what the limitations and affordances of co-authoring or doing world building with GPT. And so this took place during in Barcelona, and we were able to run this with in like 3 different languages, live and in real time. Participants kind of came into the event and first kind of started and seeding their own kind of human memories, and then use that as a place to start co-writing with GPT. From there, the kind of writing, we were using Discord primarily to kind of, you know, not only does Discord let us like live archive something, but it lets multiple people in a writer's room see what's happening in real time and begin to write together. And it also allows us to kind of cut and paste text and put it into different kinds of platforms. So we're using this in real time. We're creating this kind of, the brief is basically that at the end of this workshop, we have to deliver a radio play that we're putting out to the world. And we're using radio as this, like, everything's happening in radio time. So we're all in headphones the whole time. And we are mixing in live sounds, like think Foley, etc. And, you know, this was a workshop experiment and it went wildly successful. There were over 7 languages spoken during this radio play, and everyone created their own segments that were kind of projected out to the world. And, you know, some of the like big takeaways that I'm still like thinking about from this were things like people saying, oh man, the best thing about writing and doing this kind of world building process with AI as a member of the group was that AI became the foil, or like the fall guy, so to speak, the person in the new collaboration that would say the things that were like not very bright or just like not good. And what that did though was it liberated other human participants from feeling like they were going to be the ones to say the stupid thing. And so there was a liberatory element that came with that, which I thought was one of the things that we discovered in doing this. So I just finished this piece called Cleaning the Stables. This was at something called the Without Walls Festival in La Jolla, California. This was very much taking a lot of this work I previously was talking about in terms of precision agriculture. We've got cranes that are flying across the United States, sandhill cranes. We've got drones. We've got this kind of future of these kind of systems and thinking about. But this was about, like, you know, I called it locative cinema because it's not, again, similar to the radio piece, there's no screen to look at. So part of the thing with the radio piece that I think is really exciting is that it's all being run by audio, which it lets you kind of imagine and world build very quickly and very cheaply. And so this is now that radio play I just talked about, I just did in Paris a few weeks ago, and I've been able to deliver it in different places in the world. And each place, language, site, context completely changes it. And because it's audio, again, it's very, very light. Similarly, this was a locative cinema piece that you experienced by audio. So again, no screens. And when I say locative cinema, it's because you're kind of projecting the world that's not really there out onto the world by the audio you're listening to. And in this piece, some of the things that we were really going for, there's a live action role play element of right when you show up to the piece, you have to take on a character. And it allows you, some of my problems with a lot of immersive theater experiences, I'm not sure in this room how many people have gone to see immersive. I think you all have more immersive theater in Europe than we do in the US. but it's pretty popular here, right?
There are some experiments.
Yeah. Which I think there's so much, I mean, I'm all for, I think theater and coming together is really great. But I think a lot of it doesn't necessarily give you agency as a participant. You're oftentimes kind of outside looking in. I just went to one the other night in London by Burnt City called, it's called Burnt City by Punch Drunk. And you have a mask on and you're kind of very much a voyeur in the piece, which has its it's kind of watching a cinema live. There's some things to it that do invoke some feelings that I do like. But because I think I come more from games play world, I always want some kind of agency in it. And so this piece, my Cleaning the Stables piece that I collaborated with Robert Toomey on, was really like about exploring, can we create a game system or something where you can speak back to it and it changes. So even beyond you like live action role playing with your other people you're playing with, can the course of the audio that you're listening to change and therefore change where you're walking and what you're experiencing? So a lot of really, experiments happened in this. We didn't get it exactly right, but I would say, I don't know what they say. I would say it's a preview. It's a work in preview. So this was based on Heracles Labor 5 and really kind of taking a text piece and really pushing it into this like future. I have some of the video I was going to show you. This is from a drone. So all of these people that you see doing these activities here.
Can you make it bigger?
Yeah. All of these people, they're listening to the audio in the piece and they're doing what the audio is telling them. They're not performers in the piece, if that makes sense. They're playing the game of the world, very much invested into the world. And so there are these elements of reality and fiction that are kind of like weaving in and out of the piece. But yeah, this is a drone that's kind of shooting this and so. Okay. So another project that I've worked on in terms of world building was another 300-year out project called Junk. This was a project that is still ongoing, and obviously if anyone's here is interested in joining this, you certainly can. I work on this with Alex McDowell, who's runs the World Building Institute out of USC. And this is really thinking about a future where the world is built out of junk or detritus 300 years in the future. And so again, all of these world building projects for the most part are media agnostic, meaning we don't really care what form students or people we're working on end up producing media. If you want to work in film, I heard you were called video guy. If you want to work in video, great. If you want to work in live theater, great. But the idea is kind of creating this kind of world where hundreds, thousands of stories can emerge from, and you can kind of keep going back to. And so now, because we've been working, if I looked at my notes, I could tell you, I forgot that I can't look at my stuff. Can't remember how many schools we have in this right now, but all continents and schools across the globe. So what's really great and what's really important, I don't know, I haven't talked about this a lot, but perhaps you can, I haven't said this outright, but all of these projects, speculative design, world building, co-participatory authorship, they're only as good as like who's in the room, meaning like the more diverse, the more interdisciplinary, the more kinds of people you have in this space, it's only going to make the stories, the work stronger. And so this one is really exciting because we're right now working on the archive of this. And because it's going across so many countries, like there was one the other day in the Falkland Islands that a colleague of mine was running in Argentina. You're just getting a much more, range of stories from around the world. and starting to kind of weave them all together. I personally find building 300 years in the future extremely difficult. I'm much more a like 10 to 50 year future building person. But what I thrive on in this one is trying to think about the history. So if the goal is to be 300 years out, then I can like take my students and myself and say, let's think 250 years before. So that's like my like trick or hack. But I haven't actually said that out loud to everyone yet, but that's kind of what I do. These are just some images. These are like, this is Nebraska thinking 300 years in the future, the first one that we ran, but you can see everything from the metal scavenger here, you know, thinking about phosphorescence kind of bred into pets. And then you can see water back there, which is really funny because there's no water right now. It's the very center of the country. However, it used to be the sea in the center of the country. And I will say, the other kind of thing I haven't said about a lot of the work that I've been presenting is that we're really building on interviews with scientists. This team talked to a meteorologist. They talked to several like climatologists actually. And we're like, what do you think the, you know, climate will be like in a place like Nebraska? And so there's like, of course, like 3 extrapolations out that are speculative of what that might look like. And so in the end, of course, like the students picked up one, but it's also about working in that and I'll talk about this more in a second, but working in the more preferable zone, right? It's really easy to think about the end of the world, but how can you get students to kind of go not into a utopic space, and myself, not, you know, where it's like complete fantasy of like, yes, I want everyone to have there to be no more suffering. And I want, you know, all of these things, but I have a good cone here, I'll show in a second, but what's that preferable space? So it's not exactly completely dystopic, and it's not like completely utopic, like feeling like we'll never get there. But, you know, in that hopeful space is a driving in that range. So we really provoke this or use this kind of narrative design system. And I also, in all of these examples I'm showing you, the lab that I run is really thinking about, at the end of the day, we're building narrative design systems. So everything from the LARP that I showed you, that was an audio piece that we just did at the Without Walls Festival, is a narrative design system. You can imagine anyone else being able to use this system and putting in their own content. The radio play is a narrative design system. So it's like really helping me to think through like what these are. I think world building is a narrative design system. You know, everybody in this room, we could come up with a brief and a goal right now, and we could run it through this. And that for me right now feels like a tool. It feels like a technology, and it feels really important to the times we're living in, is to have these kind of tools that you can work with in various ways. And I'm trying to right now run them through all different kinds of projects, from like what I just showed you, which was pretty entertainment, to some more serious things that I'll talk about in a second. And so we start by asking these kind of what if, why not questions about the future, and how we can provoke and co-create new worlds and provoke these things into existence. And it's really moving us away from like this kind of singular author perspective. Even that really early example I showed you, where I was LARPing with my students in Mozilla Hubs to write their scripts. Those scripts have so many people's stories in them. It's not just like, I'm a genius, here's my script. You know, like it's all precious. It's like really open to like that notion of like getting rid of that lone genius single author. Actually, and let me just fast forward, because there's an argument to be made that world building and this notion of co-creation and getting rid of the single author is actually kind of taking us back to more oral history, oral traditions of storytelling, right? Where the griot or the bard, or I don't know what that version of in Belgium would be, but the person who had the stories that were kind of passed down orally, but they weren't that person's stories necessarily. They were very much about this kind of web network community around. And so I think that's really exciting, because I do think that we are kind of going back here. And, you know, co-creation is such a buzzword right now. I have to say it's like a little, I've been working in this space for a very long time. And all of a sudden, our in the United States, we have the National Science Foundation, which is like a main granting of science grants. And now they're putting in this, that you have to do co-creation in the grant. So it's like, you know, there's good things about that, but I'm also a little like, always a little skeptical. So again, the other thing I'll point out, because I'm weaving a lot of different things here together, but the proscenium, and noticing like where the proscenium is happening with this kind of single author or this kind of like viewpoint, but then this rise again in like what we're just talking about, immersive theater, right? Or like kind of getting rid of the proscenium, or thinking about surround audience, or thinking about where we want to be surrounded or immersed in the experiences we're watching or taking part in, and where where is that theater, where does that like cross over into games, play, these sorts of things, sports. Also, Alex really likes this word art science. So those of you, I read a lot about CLIA before I came here, but you know, I think we talk a lot about this, interrogated a lot about this as someone who's on a lot of science grants and kind of has to navigate the space back and forth and kind of continually iterate that I am not just like there to communicate the science. Like that's not what I'm there to do. But instead, you know, I'm really about like, okay, no, let's build something, let's design something together, let's like invent a world, let's invent a future. So yeah. So in this case, so I'm going to show you this one, and I also use this one. There's so many different tools that I'm like using for kind of thinking through this, but again, the art and science of provocation. And in this case, we're really thinking about like how the further you go out, the kind of like larger it is. So if you're looking at the scales out there, you might want to think world, district, street corner, character. So kind of as you go in, you get more to the individual. And as you go out, you're kind of going further out. I want to say that this is just from one world building session. These terms on the outside, in fact, they're not fixed. You could change them to be something else. In fact, when I run this, I was just talking about this earlier. I have I'm like, the word ecology is empty to me. I'm like, what does that mean exactly? Like, so I like to think about also where's technology in this, technology through everything. So, you know, I don't know if I put a blank one in here, but it's worth thinking about that these things don't have to be fixed. These are just a tool, as a model. You can put in your own words if it's really important for you to break down what culture is, which some people think it is, like you could put in, you know, or where is the technology, or where does fashion fall, which is very important. Yeah, resources, we were talking about nature versus technology earlier, but you might start to run and ask these kind of what if, why not questions. And as a team or a group that you're working with starts to populate this through images, through writing, through ideas, you start to get an idea and it starts to branch together, and you start to really formulate this kind of new world in which, as I said, thousands of stories could start to come out of. And they would all make sense because you can run them through each layer. And you can start to really come up with characters that are moving through this world. So as someone who works in games often, this is really, really great because you can imagine like how many, like if you need a system that needs to keep expanding and containing new characters and figuring out how new characters come together. The other people that I work with a lot, and I'm a part of a few different working groups of people that work on this, because believe it or not, when we were at the Screenwriting Research Network, there are people that do this all around. This is not a new thing. It's not my thing, but there's not like a there's not like a world building conference or, you know, so we were all kind of from that, we were like, we need to have like some kind of working group, or because we're all running up against things, we come across things, there's problems, there's things we all find out in different countries that we're working in. And so some of my colleagues that are working in Scandinavia right now were saying on a call recently how just because of how they're really investing in episodic television there. And so this kind of formula is really working well for young screenwriters there because it gives you so much to pull from. You know, you can imagine you just don't have one season, you have 2 seasons, you have multiple seasons, because you can keep going back to the world, and the world is so expansive, which I think is interesting. This is from Benjamin Bratton's The Stack, but another way to kind of just think about a narrative system or like a model might also be kind of in this kind of way of user interface, address, city, cloud, earth. Again, just trying to collect these kind of different models for thinking through scales of information and story and narratives. So what might a typical like session or kind of walking through like something? So this is really like a design process. And so you might start with a brief and provoking something, moving into gathering knowledge and exploring a subject. This is also the zone where you would interview experts. So like when I was talking about interviewing climatologists or et cetera, you would imagine the future through this narrative. So moving into the narrative from the research. And just like anyone in here who's done iterative design, it's not actually linear. You're kind of constantly going back and then, you know, because maybe you didn't ask the right question to start with. And so you've got to go back. And I'm going to give you a real world case example of this in a second, which is my like a zone that I have not my first time working in this area, but you then move into creating a prototype that might be, again, media agnostic. So maybe you do want everyone to make videos. Maybe you do want everyone to, at the end, to make a LARP. Maybe you do want everyone at the end to have a giant event festival. You can pick the medium, or you could have everyone have different ones, developing that further, and then outcomes, single world, multiple outcomes and stories. And you can kind of, whatever, like, let's say, if it's an exhibition, you can kind of see where these different stories kind of come together, which is really exciting. Again, this is just like one process of many. Let's see, what is this? Oh, that's not what I wanted to talk about next, but I'll come back to that in just a second. What I did want to talk about is this grant that I'm on, which I'm running this process through right now. Sorry. So in this particular, what I proposed was I was interested in trying to use substance use disorder, mental health prevention, intervention, and treatment using speculative design and world building and a participatory community well-being change process. And so I was successful in getting the grant. And so I've been running it in a very rural, like I'm in a rural town, and this is an 8-hour trip from where I'm at. So we're talking like the panhandle of Nebraska, it's the Badlands area, so South Dakota, Wyoming area. And like many rural places around the world, substance in the United States, specifically the context I can speak more closely to, substance use disorder, deaths of despair is a term that is being used, which is just really like places that have very high death rates because of not necessarily just substance use disorder, but also from things, health and depression, mental health, other sorts of things. So I'm running this process right now. I've just finished my first year of this grant. So I can't really say tell you a lot in terms of like, is it, what have I learned? I mean, I can't tell you the results yet, but, you know, I can say, so starting with the what if questions, and they've been so great. I'm working not just with people in recovery, current using, but also providers, mental health providers, substance use disorder providers. But, you know, here we can see some of the questions. The town is called Alliance, but it's like, what if Alliance stopped militarizing its police department? What if, you know, Alliance had more adult social places besides bars and churches? What if, you know, so like really like we're starting with those questions. From there, we kind of start to then create the fiction. But they're really coming out of a place of what is like lived currently. There's a book that just came out by Jane McGonigal about imagination in the future. But in that book, she talks about like, you know, in this case with this group of people, we're not doing 300 years out, we're doing 10 years out. And even for people, you know, in recovery, thinking beyond a day out is difficult. So, and with this audience, we're really focusing on 10 years, and 10 years is this place where in the book that I'm speaking about, Jane McGonigal gives this example of a village in Germany that like every 10 years, everyone just transfers ownership of whatever land you have. But it really like, you know, just being a completely wild idea that most people are like, no way, but they do it. And what is that, you know, what kind of possibilities does that open up in terms of like how we could live together? So really kind of drawing in a lot of examples like that into the work. Again, like this is coming from Joseph Voros' cone of like futures, but thinking about like all of the different kinds of ways through time that we can future. And, you know, again, when I was saying earlier, it's really easy, like, you know, Hollywood is really good at selling lots of tickets to dystopic science fiction because yes, it can be entertaining and there's a time and place for it. However, that's sometimes the easiest things to go to is kind of like these fear places, especially when working with different communities. And so really trying to push people into that green zone down there, preferable. What do you want to happen? What should happen? You know, I think has been really important. But also like agency just in general, who feels like they have a voice in the future, right? A lot of times we talk about the past being colonized, but you know, there's a lot of interesting conversations around the future and is it, you know, for certain groups, does it already feel colonized? Like, do you even have the ability to kind of like have agency into what that future looks like? The same group I'm talking to, this was like one of the designs that this is maybe not the best one to show. Let me see if I can find a different one. Well, whoops, sorry. In this case, one of the providers was talking about how they've had to really move to like telehealth and be on VR, but how they were really like what's missing from them and being able to help patients is thinking about how they can't smell and they can't see what's happening below the screen. And so, you know, there's a lot of like signals and signs that you can get from just being around someone. So we were talking a lot about this, thinking about what kinds of like innovations could happen. And so in some ways, this is very, I mean, I think this is using a kind of living lab model where the innovation is being driven top down from the community instead of, bottom up from the community instead of top down from the academy. And so kind of trying to take a lot of these ideas and designs from these world building sessions back into the university and see who wants to play, who wants to work together. And the last thing I'm going to talk about is this like other way I'm using real time and world building. I'll just play this. I have some really like great. Whoops. So I'll play this while I read some of these notes so I can. So this is a project. The last thing I'm going to hit on, and then I'm done talking because I know everyone's hot and I've talked too long. But I'm using real time and world building a lot with architects and land planners and with climate change. And specifically, this is a project I'm working on where I grew up, which is in North Carolina, which is a state on the coast. there's sea level rise, but specifically working with communities that have lost a lot of this is particularly about land that was given to let's see, how do I say this? There's something called heirs property law in the United States where slaves were given land, but there's not necessarily it's not traceable by deeds or bank. You can't trace it via the bank. And so a lot of it is up for really egregious kind of development by different corporations or just real estate developers, right? And so we're using real-time 3D technology. We're using things like photogrammetry, like LiDAR, that can start to, what I believe, collapse. We can actually take data and we can kind of pull data sets and we can start to look at like the ways that the sea level is rising in these areas. We can start to think about how you can still grow or create communities or possible futures instead of just saying, well, everyone needs to move. I mean, that's like, you know, a whole other can of worms, like, oh, you just shouldn't be building there. That's like livelihood, that's history. And so I just took place in this, I'll just see if any of this is going to play for me. So we're playing around in this zone. We're not creating this hyper real, like there are game engine technologies. This is a juke joint that we've scanned. I'm kind of just going through these spaces and we're kind of combining languages of documentary and fiction to create a new kind of aesthetic. Why are we not working in hyper real 3D? Because I think that in some ways it takes away some of the abstractness of letting people kind of project themselves into it. In this case, you can hear stories, you can hear, it becomes an archive or repository for people that are either used to live there or currently living there. And it can also have some of their ideas about what they want to be built there. So this is like this zone that a few projects I'm on are really that are working with architects and engineers. For the architects and engineers, they're actually really using these things to plan and develop. And I can use the same tools though to tell stories in. And so that's some of this. I'm going to show you. Let me see if I have this other. And actually, like, if anybody is interested in this kind of stuff or is working in these ways, there's a really great fellowship I did last year at MIT. It can be remote. You don't have to be at MIT, but it's called Worlding, which is coming out of, yeah, the I don't know. Did I just get knocked out? Weird.
Yep.
Huh.
Are you in the network?
I'll just tell you what it was really my last slide, which is a video of an old missile silo, which was a Cold War missile silo, US, Russia missile in it. The missile has been since removed, but there are all these silos in the United States that aren't being used. And so the proposition is, can we take these missile silos and use them for something else? And in this case, we want to, I'm working with a group of scientists and engineers who want to use them as an ice core training facility. So instead of having to go all the way to Antarctica to train for doing ice core work, using these missile silos where you can go way down and fill it with ice. It can also be a science education center. So we work with engineers to do LiDAR scans, which are just like laser scans, and photogrammetry, which is just putting a ton of images together from drone photography in order to kind of like spec out and see what's there. But for me being a storyteller, I'm taking that same technology, putting people in it, and you can walk through and hear the histories and also think about the possible futures. So I feel like real-time 3D has a lot of storytelling opportunities that are not just for gaming, but also help us create policy and in the projects I'm on, they're like integral for creating policy and the future of land planning. So anyway, I'll end there instead of having to connect again and all that stuff so we can have a conversation. Thank you. And I had a good quote on that. I had some Spivak on that for you. Worlding. What was I going to say there? Something about
That's fellowship.
yeah, about this term worlding, and Marx and Engels uses it again also to mean mediation. But I guess the reason I didn't say this, why I'm not super into high poly, meaning just like really hyper realistic imaging in these spaces, is because I can make an argument that when things aren't just super one-to-one representational, that can kind of lets us speak more poetically, maybe, and less like, oh, I'm like one-to-one mapping. I've created digital, like, I think there's a lot of problematics around digital twins, personally. I know that they can give us a lot of access to understanding our immune system as a digital twin, or they can help us build safer buildings that stand up during earthquakes. However, if everything's digital twinned, I think we're losing a bit of that lag. I think the lag in there, or that poetic space, is important to help tell stories with, instead of just like a one-to-one mapping.
What, I didn't understand that thing about the lag, and the lag between.
Oh, yeah. So there is the potential, like we have the technology is getting, real-time technology is getting to a place where we can actually like create pretty hyper real models that can be a digital twin to the physical, and we can actually even experience those in real time. And I understand that they have a lot of benefits for like engineering, creating safe and sound buildings, to other reasons. You might want to know if you're having surgery and you want to have a scan sent to your telehealth doctor of your heart or whatever. Like, there are reasons to have very precise digital twins of the physical. However, in this case, I'm arguing that that lag, or like the non-representational, like things that are low polygons, like the images I was showing you that don't look hyper real. I think that they have a lot of potential for telling stories when you're co-creating with the community that you are, in this case, I'm not from that community, but I'm working with to tell stories in a co-creation process. I think it allows, the lag time actually allows, or the non-one-to-one allows for space for generating and co-creating that doesn't feel just so like hyper real one-to-one. It allows for a space of to borrow some, I don't know if you're familiar with the filmmaker Trenti Menha, she Vietnamese American filmmaker who shot a lot of really early things in Senegal. She would always say, I want to speak near by instead of for, in terms of like when she was doing ethnography or documentary. So I think there's similar conversations in co-creation, especially when you're co-authoring, or I'm not a part of the substance use disorder community I'm world building with. However, how do you create a space where the stories, or the container for the stories, feel like they have a space that they can live, that feel like I'm necessarily coming up with the aesthetic for them. It's, it's a dance, if that makes sense.
Sure.
What I like in this is the possibilities between the real and the real time, because the real time remains representation in the end. And I was fascinated by this combination of audio cinematography, or what did you call it?
Locative cinema.
Yeah, where you actually work as an actor or participant of their spectators. That was not clear to me. What is the relation? But in any case, the actor or participant participates to audio rather than to visuality.
Yeah.
The working of audio in our connection with the real here and now is different from visuality.
Yes.
Visuality, even here and now, involves projection. With audio, is not the case. Even in our brain, it's processed differently. And I think this makes sense that this is another kind of way of world building. You use, of course, imagination.
Yes.
You use your internal
Theater of the mind.
your
Yeah.
Plato's cave. You use it, so there is still representation going on. But the relation to the real, not just through real time, but by the audio while you are present, is different. And it's interesting that it works and that you can do a lot of stuff that way. And I mean, there are many more possibilities for exploration than I even started to realize with this. World building is a much larger concept than I thought. So that's just a remark that I wanted to make. The other thing, on the other hand, is you showed some methodologies that can be used, but there are many ones that are very different and probably not all applicable on the same kinds of situations. So there is still a lack of understanding of what's going on there.
Yeah, and I mean, I would say that is, I mean, where I'm at in terms of research is I'm very interested in co-authoring whatever that looks like. I'm still collating, collecting, pulling things together, because everyone I work with kind of has different teachers. I learn new things, and that textbook has not been written yet. So there's not, like, when I'm showing all these different things, you're absolutely right. And that's why also these informal working groups that I'm working with people around the world, they're so important, because also culturally specific, there's things that won't work in the UK that will work in the US. There's things that will not work in Belgium that would work in France. You know, like, it's so important to have these conversations about, the tools and the methods and what's working, what's not working.
I would like to ask about the relationship between the story, the narrative, and the built world, because the world, as I understand, is kind of a static structure. There are certain rules, there are certain objects that are there all the time, but then the narrative is the sequence in time, which I assume takes place in that world. So obviously the worlds will have an influence on the narrative in the sense that the world puts certain constraints, so the thing that can happen or that cannot happen. But on the other hand, you can in principle make an infinite number of narratives within the same world. So what's the most important, maybe, or how do you see the relationship between the story on the one hand and the world on the other?
I mean, I think it's really specific to the context of who and what I'm working with. How many people here has worked in world building or taught it or done something with students? I'm really curious to hear what your experience with it. But for example, a lot of very young students, not actually very young students are great. It's more, there's a certain age group, and maybe it's the age where we get obsessed with ourselves, that it feels really hard to get people to go really big and get them to actually world build. They're so into the characters, or they want to stay with the individual. And I'm always like, I don't care. You know, I'm like, let's like think about the rules, which I think is, when you talk about the world, I think how you just framed it, I think it's like the rules of the world. So like what can happen and what can't happen in this world. And if we stay to those, we can kind of start to weave things in and out, as long as we all agree on these kind of rules.
Which age is it?
I would say, actually, I would say my first year undergraduates are like much more difficult than working younger.
Mhm.
I think that younger people are
What's that meaning years, like 20 something?
18,
18,
yeah,
okay.
17, 18, yeah.
That's the difficult ones.
I think it's
And
very,
the easy
very,
ones are the 12
And the
year
best
ones.
ones?
I think, I mean, in my case, I have worked with kids from kindergarten until university level, and I would agree will be more around vierde leerjaar. So it should be more or less the same time, like 10, 12 years old.
Mm.
If they are too young, they cannot engage. It's just something else. And if they are at the teenager level, they don't believe I have constantly to prove there is something. I do something or something.
Yeah.
They're testing me constantly.
Yeah. Well, I wonder too, I mean, and you know, how much. Sorry, I want to come back to your question because I think there's also some. Okay, I'm curious if other people have answers to what was just asked, but I think this is also there's something going on too with the notion of the single author and wanting to really control the narrative. I think you have to give up a part of that to do world building, and not everyone wants to do that. A lot of people really want to have control and be the lone author, the auteur, and that's okay too, but it's not world building.
You made me curious saying that you don't, like, you have your doubts about the co-creation. So like, where are you on this?
Anytime something becomes like a kind of a word that starts to get used a lot, I'm always like, okay, what's that?
Okay. So it's just about the use.
What was the word?
Co-creation.
Okay.
It's very positive.
Yeah, it's very buzzy, and I'm like, oh,
But you say you sound skeptical about single author, but also about co-creation. So where are you? Like,
Oh, but co-creation used in grant processes, that was the point, right?
on Instagram.
co-authoring is not
And what?
co-authoring. You can have.
Oh yeah, no. Yeah, I mean, what is that the difference? I don't know.
So do you prefer
Well,
to
it's
create?
old-fashioned,
Yeah.
Isn't it the altering will be more meaning to some? It seems to me that it's kind of more like a stamp, like already you're an author,
Right.
you write a book. But
I mean, okay.
close to real time.
You're opening a huge can of worms. It's like very, because you know what, I'll tell you why the creation thing, I do say co-creation because it's the easiest thing that people understand world building. If I have to really kind of sum it down for talking across disciplines.
Yeah.
However, my issue with creation is general, is, if anyone know, it's very American, but Max, HBO Max, which is like a streaming platform, just took away all of its directors and producers and show like all the like credits, and now everyone's a creator. And this is like a thing because everything, as we start to, this is happening. So now everyone's a creator. Simultaneously, this word content, right? So I think that there's a combination. I don't know if this might not be a relevant conversation for this group, but the word content is problematic because it's like what is art versus what is content, creator versus author.
Things don't have content, only producing content. But everybody else is creating empty shells, we are creating content.
We have somebody online.
Oh yeah.
But in the case of the HBO Max, or anybody's a creator, so like distinction between disciplines is completely
Nothing. Gone.
erased.
So this is when I say I'm a little like, I don't know, there's like thing going on. I think it's like we're in prickly times of like, also like no one's an artist anymore, everyone's a content creator. And that just, to me, like it just kind of speaks to like an endless stream of things that don't have meaning. It's just like there's things to consume. I don't know.
If you don't have disciplines, you cannot have inter or transdisciplinarity either. But if you don't have writers or directors or actors, even if they go over their borders and do other things, you do not have the process of filmmaking anymore.
Yeah, I don't
There's
think it's
something else.
totally.
Yeah.
I mean, even
Yeah, let's maybe hear from Stephen online. Yeah, Stephen. Hello.
Yeah. Hi. Thanks. I wasn't actually sure if I would be let in. Yeah. So the way I'm a professor in game design and have been working with different aspects of participatory media and performance and world building. And one of the things that and this question is always central in this about agency and authorship. And one of the things that we work with is like agenting or architecting, rather, building the constraints and the affordances, and then giving sort of scalable contexts like magic circles within magic circles. And then those contributions are also, they are a form of co-production or co-authoring, but they have value in their own right of those participants and the contributions that they make. So it's important to also give the credit to those that are actually coming up with something creative or artistic within a framework that affords that and is built for those affordances. So I guess that's kind of a long-winded way of how we look at it from game design anyways, or a classical game design approach, I think. Yeah, thanks.
Yeah.
I mean, do you want Patty?
No, but maybe answer. It's building on it, but not that many.
I just think wanted to share like this framework that I work. It's called Music Belgium, and it's something that it exists in. When I was really active on that, like in 7 countries, 5 in Europe and 2 in South America, and it's coming through as a Jewish musician famous that I cannot never remember his name. But anyway, so it was created after the Second War, and then it's based on co-creation. That's like, I'm living 14 years here, and back then already that was the pitch. And like, this is about co-creation. So when you go to the school, they have a pool of artists. When you go, and then there's somebody who is the one who is the director, is going to the schools in Belgium, and he's pitching the project, and the pitch is that basically we are not teachers, but we are artists. So then he finds a school, you have a school, and you have a particular interest perhaps with dance and photography. So then Tom checking, and then we'll see dancer and photographer, and then they put them together, they pass it there, and then they start building something where the school understands that they are not teachers, we are not teachers, but we are artists, and we work in co-creation with the students. I'm mentioning this in terms, I'm trying to bring the idea that in that framework, that what is important is that the framework that we are not teachers, for instance. Mm-hmm. So we co-create something that is an abstraction from the teacher, from the teacher. Yeah. But it is defined with the students along 10 sessions.
Yeah, I'd be curious what that system is. It sounds a little bit like kind of Auguste Boal and Paulo Freire's Theater of the Oppressed, or just thinking Pedagogies of the Oppressed, where those books or that all of that is really positioned around the co-learner, like the teacher as the co-learner. Right. In the space. But yeah, I would be curious to like if you could. What is it called? Yoke?
It's called music, like the group. Music, Belgium, and you have music in different countries.
Okay, music.
The base is used in Belgium, but there is another 5 countries in Europe.
I would think that this kind of stuff can only work when it somehow is localized. The HBO thing doesn't convince. Why? Because there is this gigantic power relationship between the structure having these technologies and controlling the financial streams. It's very nice. They don't have to pay anybody anymore. It's while in a local setting, in a school where people are lively present, using technologies to exchange with other localities, yes. But there you can see this work. So it can turn exactly its opposite if you bring it on another scale. And if the power relation becomes too big, right?
Because I think in my experience, what I think it worked from the project is I'm not an art teacher in the school. I talk to the art teachers, and they are the art teachers, so they have they are there all the time. I go there really fresh, and I bring this fresh, and so it works. Like, for instance, one of the things that work for the artists, and that's why they understand that they are artists, is although I propose 10 sessions, if at some point I have a gig in between, I arrange with the school, and then for 3 weeks I'm not coming. So it's not that there is this complexity in terms of time that is always possible because it's a microcosmos. Even my boss disappeared. He just introduced us, they put us together, and the boss disappeared. It's just the school and the artists who feel with the students.
It's a nice example of emergence, I would say, right? It seems to
I think it works
Yeah, I wanted to maybe offer another part to the question, and I think it relates to this idea of investment in the world also, because for that, like we all, like the moment the world becomes alive, it's actually the people want to live in it, when people want to inhabit it, and you cannot do that alone. This is the nice thing that the real world has, that it's kind of needs us all invested to keep it running. I mean, you can, of course, with the suspension of disbelief, you have this incredible infinite possibility of spawning new worlds, and this is a great external philosophy because it makes us realize how already we are basically also constructing the world. And I mean, we brought up Spivak, like the world is worlded for us, but like actually there is so many perspectives. But then from there, we also need to come back, like from this beautiful, we have so many possibilities, we have so many different perspectives and worlds, to actually want to also live in the same world. And that is something that I think, let's say you can tell your students in the sense that this is the moment it becomes a beautiful story. And the question I have there for you or us or all is indeed then how, I'm very busy with time in a way. How do you return to a world? Also, how do you care for a world? How do you then have the moment of iteration? Because we have limited time also. And then, that's a good method.
Yeah, and you were just making me think of when you were just how you started out I was also thinking about the concept of Umwelt, or like this, you know, but also from like interspecies or multi-species, like it's not just like human time, it's like these other time, like prairie dog time, or you know, amoeba time, like completely working on different time scales. Yes, and
but is there not one, and that goes a little bit back to Francis's question. I don't think we can exhaust this completely here, but maybe just that the status of the world, or however we want to interpret it, but that's the one world that we, in some sense, co-create, but it's there when we come. We are born into it. Yeah, it's not a world that we create and then we populate it or have opened it up for others to be populated. So the basic ontology of situatedness is different. And I think we should not lose this out of sight, and that points into the direction of what these different relationships of time and investment mean, and how we can coordinate them and make them cooperate by not forgetting that the world somehow exists, whatever that means. I'm not wanting to start a philosophical discussion about it, but the fact that we are present here and now is enough to point that out. And from there, and from other places here and now, we can start to spawn worlds, as you said.
But I also think that there's such a conversation going on right now about, like I just saw this on something the other day of like, is reality co-created? And this was in regards to basically
I missed something.
Something was co-created here.
The movement was very good.
Everyone with that pen is reality co-created.
Is reality co-created? But I think, you know, I think that this was on in these talks that I was looking at. However, it has this whole other gravity in terms of you know, thinking about how much narrative in terms of the news, in terms of other ways that people are getting information, is shaping people's, you know, reality. That can be spending time in the same space, but have completely different, you know, I guess like where are the lines of worldview versus completely like, I believe this to be true, and this is my fundamental understanding of how the world works. I mean, everything from flat earth to you know, I mean.
But these are world building sports, right?
Yeah.
That's not reality in the sense of the place where you are here now. These are all world building creations, I would say.
It's kind of like weird because like if you say that reality, maybe it's a more of a question for the bar, but if reality is co-created in real time, I mean the reality that's
In real time, yeah.
It is you are speaking about it's a thing which is co-created in real time. Yes. So how come that within that you can speak about things that are not? You know, and now you have to distinguish from those things that are not and go back to those features.
But things that are not is quite a recent invention, right? Things that are not we invented quite recently.
This not is kind of fake, yes, because if the general reality is co-created in real time, all those things we consider not to be co-created in real time is a kind of like illusion that they are not co-created in real time. If the general feature of the reality is that it is co-created in real time, yeah.
Yeah. Okay. No, I think it's very clear. What you're saying is exactly the discussion between Plato, Heraclitus, Parmenides, and Aristotle 2,500 years ago. It's exactly this. You did very well, but this is not. I mean, it's of course funny to some extent, but it's very relevant as well. And I would never say that if reality is co-created, let's say that this is an open question, but I would never add in real time in the sense that you use that concept, because real time in the sense that you use that concept is representational. It's part of this world building machine somehow. So it's the time in which we really are, the immediate, not immediate, but the immediate time is not real time in the sense that you.
It's even more real.
But what we're doing right now is a bit like, it seems to me kind of like I agree with most of you, but it seems to be that we are kind of in a way, it seems to me it's kind of like getting lost in some kind of sophism where we are trying to define what reality is, which I think humanity has not solved this in a way. So what I think I'm personally more interested is in the creation of some, I mean, some people speak about this reality as the end of the world as we know it. As in this idea that, so this like what you will call like real time or this worlding as the end of the world as we know it. And in that sense that you don't have to then compromise them and agree with what is the world.
But I don't think the problem here was that somebody tried to define what the world was or what real was. She was just pointing out that if you say a certain sentence, namely reality is co-created, then it doesn't make sense to speak about something that is not. That's not an attempt at defining, that's fact.
But it was Shakespeare that invented the word unreal. No? We didn't have such a word before. Yeah.
So the word stays.
So it's quite a new idea, like this idea of the unreal.
It is already fully there with the ancient Greeks, absolutely, completely. It's not maybe the vocabulary that we use now, but the word reality, for instance, is a translation of Aristotle's Ennead.
Sure, but the
from Maya as this illusion thing, yeah. Which is also unreal.
The formal idea of not in the logical sense, yes, that's a modern invention. With Aristotle, you will always start with the affirmation of something and then the negation of it, never with the negation. That's a formal thing. There's this idea of empty formalism, and there we can get into sophisms, but that was not the subject that you were touching. And I don't say that we have to have this discussion. By the way, my presentation next week will touch on some of these topics, so it's maybe the natural continuation of this. But it makes sense to ask these questions in the context of all the possibilities that world building create, because we still want to have some notion of what are we doing here. And this is important to understand the consequence.
But I guess like maybe what I was trying to introduce is this concept of like the end of the world as we know it, like as we know it, and that will mean something different for each one. So then it's when I propose worlding, then it's the end of the world as I know it.
Okay.
And then from there I start. And I don't have to go to the other thing that is a huge humanity.
But does world building have to be like another world?
But that's why so
Can
many
you not,
people
can world building not be
appropriate.
this world?
Yeah,
I
I mean,
mean,
it is. I
it's-
mean, that's the argument. I mean, that's like science fiction or like most futuring science fiction world building is really about the present. It just gives us space in order to.
But there's always some kind of displacement,
Yeah,
right?
yeah, the
So
present in a non-present way.
there's always some kind of displacement, right? Like that's also what you were, that's somehow what you were listing in the beginning,
Yeah.
right? These kind of lag,
Collapse, yeah.
collapse, something,
Entropy.
science fiction. So it's like, I mean, you could have world building, which is like historical. So it doesn't have to be fictional, it could be historical.
Yes, history is a kind of world building if you want.
But then there's still this kind of separation in time. You still then put it in the future or in the past.
Yes.
What happens if you put it in the present?
Well, I mean, I didn't expand on the improvisation part of the talk very much, but I mean, I think there's a lot we could talk about with like, what is the rehearsal? Like, what does a rehearsal do? Some people, so sorry, I don't know if this might be like really abstract to get your answer, but I'm working with Kathleen Gray, who was one of the original biospherians who created Biosphere 2 in Arizona, which is this was an experiment in the 70s, but they've done several other projects. Well, for Kathleen, there's a really great documentary about their work called Spaceship Earth, kind of taking from Buckminster Fuller's book. Anyway, for Kathleen, their process to get them to the biosphere to do all of the kind of crazy art science things they did was theater. And theater, because theater has in it this ability to rehearse. And so you can rehearse possibilities of worlds basically through theater. And in that rehearsal, it's experiential. She would say that was the driving force that created all of their giant projects that they're known for. The engine was theater. It was their daily practice. It was where they could rehearse all of these like possible worlds. So we didn't talk a lot about that, but I think there's something interesting in that, the rehearsal, Jodorowsky, filmmaker in Mexico, had a theater group for a while called the Panic Theater. And it was before he started making the films he's known for. And an old professor of mine who is from Mexico City would argue that every Sunday they had this Panic Theater was wild, kind of like very Artaud, naked debauchery on stage, but it would always end by people flooding out into the streets of Mexico City, taking a grand piano and bashing it apart. And, my professor during graduate school would say, this precisely laid the groundwork for the Mexican Revolution, because what it did is, even if you weren't there, that the hearing about that, like being someone, buying a taco the next day from someone, that all just like expands out into the street. And so it was the ritual theater practice, the rehearsal, the theater practice of bashing apart the piano every week. So I didn't talk a lot about that in this, but I think there's something to be said for that, the ritual, the practice, the rehearsal, the being able to, I think that's what is in the live act. I'm actually thinking right now, live action role play has the potential in it as a design concept to, I think it's like really, I think it has a lot of potential for world building. Like you can exercise, you can rehearse so many different things.
Yeah, I guess I'm interested here in this like artifice, to the extent to which a certain amount of artifice is necessary to get it going. And I'm as a provocation, I'm sort of trying to ask the opposite question. Like what happens when you take the artifice away, right? When you just come back to this world, but still apply the same principles and somehow the same techniques.
I would hate to say this is not the answer you're gonna like, but that's essentially what they're doing with like reality TV. in some kinds of ways, no? I mean, it's like, it is very much like a kind of constructed artificial, I don't know, I'm just throwing that out there. Is that a kind of what they're doing of like a present alternate?
Like
Conspiracy theories, maybe.
Yeah.
I like the thing about theater because, of course, theater stems from ritual. We know this, right?
Mhm.
And the fact that in theater it's the only representational art in the sense of scenographic. You have to make a scene where you represent a world and a story in it, where everybody is really there in the present world.
Mhm.
And that's the reason why this kind of stuff indeed works somehow. The principle of repetition and the principle of rehearsal, etc. Because you are indeed there in the real world. So the ontological boundary is much less steep, if you want it.
Yeah, building on that, I think it's, and I want to offer another, like, I think the lived memory of the body and what it does on a deeper level, that stays with you. And actually similar like dreams, your brain can't even really tell them so much apart. So, which is also why trauma, like it is actually used in trauma, dealing with trauma, for example. So, or yeah, in relation to role play and therapy, actually, I was also thinking, I was wondering about improvisation and your experience with it, because on the one hand, yeah, you have like it used in free association, for example, and psychoanalysis uses it or something to get to more subconscious layers, and it brings up kind of like that element as well to tell us about who we are, which is also why Bleed is so interesting. We're in characters because you actually never get away from yourself anyway.
Yeah.
But then also what happens is that you often come up with rather stereotypical things. And I wonder how you navigate with that in your designs. And one thing I wanted to note is that I really like the way that you describe the work with the chat.
Oh yeah.
As a tool who almost detoxifies basically all the stereotypical stuff that we need to, like the mechanical parts of our conversation that already is so much kind of like a burden to it. And then someone has to do that job, and then we can refine and build on top of that and actually break it, and we get the fun part.
Oh, absolutely.
And so that part I really loved, or made me think. But then, yes, the question, sorry, was how else also, I mean, that was one example maybe, but how else do you work around like drilling in, getting deeper to not to like shed the maybe more stereotypical stuff that often comes up when people,
Has anybody
put on the spot?
Yeah, no. I mean, has anybody in here done improv classes or
trying to be funny is another one, right? Like, really, how do you get out of there? Like, I mean, and there's many tools, but I'm wondering what are yours, or like what do you think about it?
Yeah, there's like this. There's probably even something like there's probably even a word for this, but I know what you're talking about with the stereotypical thing. There's like the idea like with when you're like learning comedy. The first thing, you know, it's never the best thing. There's always you like you shouldn't be. The other trick with improv is like you should never go in planning what you're going to say. It really has to be like you have to, even if you're like running a bit, you have to like, let's say there's like the really famous exercise of like go through a strange door, and when it's your turn comes up, you're supposed to enter in, and you're going to go in some weird way. You're supposed to even like our tendency is to plan like I'm going to do something funny. I know what I'm going to do. It's like, no, you've got to even take that, throw it away, and really push yourself out there to like go beyond, like not have a plan, which is like.
That was your game, right?
Yeah.
What's your game?
That's the game.
I did some games on the workshop.
Awesome.
Last weekend. I do a lot of this stuff.
Awesome. Well, yeah, clowning. I mean, there's so much.
Explain a
Yeah,
bit,
yeah.
explain a little bit the exercise with the objects, because that really fits in the discussion.
Would you like to explain? I'm curious to hear you explain.
No, don't do that to me.
We can also play it in the bar.
I'm willing to explain it.
Yes.
Okay.
The exercise was called being good at being bad, and the idea was that you would use an ordinary object that everybody knows how to use, and pretend that you really don't know how to use it, and use it in a completely wrong way. But it wasn't specified what was the completely wrong way, and then people were supposed to applaud or to boo if they liked the wrong way you were using it, and boo it when it was kind of not very effective.
I love it. It reminds me, there's this, we should play it. I like games a lot. It reminds me of, has anyone read this piece of writing called The Body Rituals of the Nasarima? Have you read that?
Actually,
you are?
I'm writing a
Oh yeah, well then, yeah, you can talk, you want to tell everyone what it's about?
Yeah, in 1907, there was an anthropologist called Milner. He wrote a fictional essay called The Body Rituals of the Nakrima, and it was an imagined society from the perspective of the future, and their kind of body rituals. I'm not sure what he's going to say about it.
Yeah, well, I was going to say that. So my understanding of the piece is that it's American backwards, and it's basically looking at all of the body rituals of like what we think of as like a normal American body ritual, but like put like kind of made alien. So made strange.
The essential like narrative devices, defamiliarization.
Yes, yeah.
Defamiliarization.
Okay.
It's like, and I would say that that's like a thing that to your, I'm sorry, what is your name? I'm trying to, Laura.
No.
I'll be Laura.
Did you not say Laura?
But we're having new names. We're gonna have new names today.
Okay, so we're already building a new world. Okay, you're Laura. So Laura, but I would say that this is when you're asking about like how do you go deeper with improv and all of that. I mean, I think that we haven't talked about that, but like defamiliarization or like what's the root Ostranye, the Russian word, you know, like how it's like making the familiar strange, but also what you really want to do, which is making the strange familiar, maybe flipping it or something. The mundane, familiar, strange, mundane, strange. But yeah, defamiliarization. I mean, that's like the primary, like that's what's at work with like science fiction and.
Yeah, I mean, Victor Shklovsky. Yeah, he said it's like sometimes the foundation of all art, that you create things in a way that makes them seem unfamiliar. Without the perspective of seeing.
Well, I'm an amateur photographer, and my photos often are very common, ordinary objects that looked at in such a way that you can recognize it and ask people what is it to say. That's kind of an abstract painting. It's kind of cracking a wall or some nuts or.
Yeah.
It's funny though, because there is something that your question, there's also something about doing the obvious thing that's often the smartest thing, or like sometimes it's the funniest thing too. The first thing that you think of is often the funniest. Yeah, there's also that kind of training, right, where you train yourself not to filter yourself. The first thing is often not funny, not because it's the first thing, but because it's actually not the first thing. You've already filtered out the first thing because you thought it was too bad or too stupid or too rude.
I think liars are really interesting.
Liars.
Like very like people like there's I've read a lot about like people who have the ability. I think they're like amazing world builders, and they can contain like multitudes of worlds in their heads that they have to kind of continue and have to kind of to be really efficient and effective. You have to remember those things
Yeah, yeah,
across multiple contexts and time and space.
That's why we have an international conference of liars every year.
Do you really?
Yeah.
So there is
We
the
bring all,
conference
like,
on lions,
like,
but not on world building. That's
Attend those conferences. You go to those conferences?
I curate it.
What?
You are a member.
It's like an international conference of like pathological liars.
He's too good. But there is something weird with improvisation in the sense that I think you have at least two different types. One is the one where you really do something completely unprepared, almost innocent. But often improvisation only becomes possible after a long course of appropriation of something, like a musical instrument. If you improvise on a guitar and you can't play the guitar in general, it will not be very interesting. But people that know their instrument so well that they can forget about the instrument playing and just do whatever they like. So there is improvisation is not it's a bit an ambiguous kind of concept here.
Yeah, and also like I'm in this debate right now with my friend because she really dislikes the word play. And because she thinks it gets kind of oftentimes taken as non-serious, even though it can do very serious and change, it can be very serious. Serious play can change the world. And animals play, and a lot of, there's all this stuff written about play is the highest form of research. I think Einstein said that, and there's a lot of books that have been written about play. Man Games Play, that book. Anyway, so we've been thinking about the word improvise. The thing is animals, would anybody in the room say animals improvise?
No.
Yeah.
No.
See, I mean, someone else said yes, and I'm like, so why can you tell me how an animal improvises? I mean,
well, because normally what most animals do is when they want to like hunt, for example, or they just want to know how to be a tiger, they'll go to the library and get a book out about how to be a tiger, and then they'll follow the instructions verbatim. But occasionally they don't have that book, and then they have to improvise.
No, but I would say they play. Obviously they play and they enjoy playing. But I would never call it improvisation because indeed, here is Mr. Funny, this conceptual interface, they clearly do not pass through to get to their play. Although they learn and they play and they feel and they enjoy. Clearly.
But isn't it this a factor that to agree that the animals are improvising, then we have to then, before saying that, to then assume what are the roles for the improvisation. So like, and we don't know really what the animal is thinking. So what is the role of the animal?
But
is being the predator or being chased?
But that's a human way of looking at the animal. That's not the animal looking at itself.
But that's what I'm saying, that if we try to speak about the animal, improvisation is way ahead of what we
I agree. I think it doesn't make much sense, but I agree.
I agree. I think we're improvising right now. So
we would say, I have no plan, I'm improvising. That's what an animal does all the time. Right?
Yeah.
They have no plan.
I'm not sure.
Right? But then that's one sense of improvisation. The other one is improvisation theater, where you say, let's start a fiction.
Yeah.
And I'll say, well, I'm a salesman, and I'm selling pens to you. I want pens, I don't know. And then you will be yes.
I have a question.
Animals with that.
If I go out now and I go to the toilets and I want to come back because this is very interesting, but I walk without planning and thinking, and I did not study how to. I'm walking, and you can say it's a kind of play, but I'm not improvising my walk, even if it's not planned out before. That's inappropriate to say, I think.
I didn't say
it doesn't make sense.
That's improvisation. It's not necessarily play. It's necessarily.
Well, it's more play than improvisation, I would say. But okay.
If I might steer the conversation, like, and if we introduce the idea of content for it, like then when we speak about improvisation, and there's some exercise, there is some theory of like faking. That is, I think it's been said in the 80s, and it's the opposite of what some point we were talking. This if I will try to read properly or try to do my best to, I just take a book and start reading to you guys Japanese. It will be funny, or it will have a body because of my limitation, and I will try to do the best I can. So in that sense, it's the opposite of what you were saying some time ago, that you're trying to do something bad that you really are good at. That's the problem, for instance, you have like in dance as a choreographer. It's very complicated to work for me with dancers who are, have knowledge, because I don't have the time to go with them into something that is meaningful to me right now. So then I'd rather I work with a sculptor, for instance, because he will have a content already.
Yes, I see. Yeah. I think you're right.
So then the content for that, I found that interesting, that the content in terms with the improvisation, then I think, I don't know, there's more like a question into the space that when you are master, because I don't completely agree what you were saying in terms of improvisation and when you're really mastering your instrument, then also it's true that you will enter in patterns. While when you are so you need to pass some threshold of knowledge. You cannot just go and start trying to play the guitar without not knowing that's something different. That would be funny, but I don't know.
That's what I said.
But then the thing you were mentioning, like if you master, you use the word if you master the instrument. So what I'm trying to introduce here, like, so not the mastering that before, because what I'm saying here, when you master the instrument, as in dancing, also if you have so many training in dance, like you feel when you're dancing, you are repeating yourself. That's not fun. It's a creator. So then when you are an amateur, when you have some kind of leverage.
Yeah, there is an intermediate level. That's
well, as at the floating out, like that's kind of the flow. You can enter a flow state because you are not going there when you are stressing, but also you are not completely know what you're doing. You enter a kind of a interesting state that in terms of content proposes a body that the audience can perceive.
But I think that somebody who masters his instrument can do that too. Although
it takes more time. Like obviously it takes more time. Yeah,
I understand why you say this. Yes.
Now would be the time that we move it to the bar. Would that be okay?
I think it's a good idea. Let's give it to Ash.